We talked a lot about different examples, and there were some lovely examples of significant changes that had happened. For example, a woman in Beirut who had managed to change the law as a result of the work that she had been doing. So that got us to a discussion about the need to take greater risks, be more courageous, and actually articulate the change we are seeking. Fundamentally, what can we learn from this practice as well? So let's not think it's about us bestowing the gift of our own wisdom on communities. Let's be very clear about how much we have to learn. We need to interrogate our own privilege, after all. And then finally, I think, to just say that it's really important that we stay relevant. So if we stay relevant, that means we have to be part of the conversations and ask ourselves, where do those conversations happen? Where do the big decisions get made? So get involved in neighbourhood planning. Get involved, become a governor of your local primary school. Get involved in the business improvement district. Be prepared to sit in those meetings and be part of the conversation, be at that table. Because as well as the influence that you can make, you can also gain a lot in terms of understanding your own work. And it's all about that general asset building. Sorry, not so articulate, forgive me.
So, we were looking at what do you understand by the civic role of arts organisations, and we went straight to a bigger picture. We took the word civic out of it. What is the role of arts organisations? And we kind of stayed with that big picture, actually, throughout. So if you can imagine a discussion that started with what is the role of arts organisations and finished with, crikey, what's the point of arts organisations? And there's something about also not being too navel-gazing in all of this and seeing kind of beyond. The notion of civic and the challenge of thinking about this is not just limited, of course, to the arts sector. That whole concept of society and what it means to collectively experience things together has been lost. So what is our role in that bigger picture, I think, was something that we kept returning to. There's also the danger of compartmentalizing this kind of thing. You know, someone pointed out education departments turning into creative learning departments, turning into engagement departments. There could be a civic department. You know, there's a real danger of turning this into something that's about management as opposed to a lived, felt experience of people doing work with people. People talked about, and the danger of it being ephemeral. You know, all this language and the word civic and these big words can get away from the very honest experience. Someone was talking from Spare Tire about someone doing cross-stitching, or no, it was someone else, cross-stitching in their bedroom. And that helped them solve a problem. There's something about the civic dimension that actually is about problem solving in a very personal way, in a very immediate, you know, on your street with the people that you love, the people that you know. I think that was also, well, Kyle was in our group, had done the work in Contact. And the danger of this work being all about a bigger agenda when that language is irrelevant to people, and how that becomes something that is real in the spaces. Of course, we got into, well, do you need a building to do this? What is the space that can enable that kind of work to happen? Touched a little, I thought this was really interesting, on the 19th century idea of what civic meant, and you know, the post-war idea of building a whole new world, and what that would mean. So what does civic mean now to us this particular year? What kind of power does that have? Bearing in mind also Chrissy's point earlier about the role of women and the practice over all of these years. How can we make that real? Lastly, someone pointed out civic, I like this, civic is connected with the idea of other. So it involves, of course, what our friend from government said around empathy. So what role does that have in this kind of discussion?
As I said to the little workshop that I was in, I was probably the only person from the kind of social side of things in the room. So I had to ask lots of questions to actually understand what it was that was being discussed in the room. And I think that's probably the first point that I want to make, which there was a lot of discussion about language. And I started off thinking, well, this is just about semantics. Let's get the semantics out of the way. But the longer the discussion went on, the clearer I became that actually what we're lacking is a common language. So our group was supposed to be looking at the gaps. What are the gaps, and what's preventing the civic role in arts organizations? And common language certainly came out as a really important one, that very often social organizations and community organizations, social organizations, and arts organizations actually don't understand each other. I think there was a really strong feeling in the room that we shouldn't think about arts organizations the whole time, that actually arts, particularly in their civic role, was something that didn't necessarily happen in arts organizations. Very often it happened in social spaces, in old people's homes or in other settings where the community was. So it was about how artists and arts organizations can deliver in those circumstances. So again, there was a little bit of anxiety about really about how constraining the topic is in terms of arts, the civic role of arts organizations. So I think people were much easier talking about how the civic role of the arts can be implemented in communities. We had a really interesting discussion about how one breaks down the silos, how one brings the two sides together a lot more, what's required, how we communicate better, and maybe some sort of brokerage role, a way for the two sides, the civic side and the art side, to come together. We had discussion about infrastructure and how maybe in the past there was more infrastructure for arts organizations or artists to carry out their civic role. There were spaces, there were educational opportunities, and a lot of those are now starting to disappear. So again, as the workshop that I was in was looking at gaps, that was identified as a really important gap. And then finally, there was some sense of self-deprecation in the room as well, that actually we all need to do a lot better in understanding what it is that our communities want from the arts and being much more responsive in how we deliver it.
Our group was talking about how do you identify good practice? We started off with a provocation or statement or conversation around how people should be first and artists and arts organisations should get out the way. So that was the sort of the provocation. We moved around that to shift away from the focus of artists as specialists and organisations as providers, and that the empowerment should be for the people, whoever that might be, and communities themselves. And obviously that kind of is reflected in some of the success of Sellers Fund Palaces. We also talked around getting away from the deficit model. And it's interesting how, both in my work running NPO and as a person, my personal work as an artist, and just generally speaking, there's a lot of talk about, low engagement and cold spots. And when you're actually involved in working alongside communities, that isn't the case. So just to move away from the deficit model, the idea there is nothing happening in regions and spaces around the country, and we've got to do something about it. That sort of, that kind of attitude. And we also then talked about the how. So how do we? That's one way of sort of understanding more, is to measure things differently. We talked a lot about the notion of bean counting, as I would call it, where we talk about, bums on seats and cash flow that proves that we're successful in organisations or institutions. But we're not talking about the contact or the conversations or the use of space or the kinds of new people or even the developed relationships that happen within the buildings or within the organisations, or in terms of the one-to-one initiatives that we might be involved in terms of our commissions. And we mentioned that sustainability is crucial. I'll just say that because there was a lot talked about sustainability and what that might mean. And one of the ways of thinking around funding was to look at an ecosystem and think less about hierarchies and less about the idea of the other. So the idea that you're funding an ecosystem, you're thinking around the whole kind of way in which the arts is either engaged with or presented by organisations or individuals. And there's no kind of other out there, that we're all sort of within an ecosystem. And then also we talked about a little bit around governance as well, and changing in terms of diversity. We talked a little bit about the question that Lynn raised, or was raised by someone in the audience earlier on, about the high preponderance of women in the industry. And I personally think that's a great thing, and talking about what that means in terms of the value of the work that we do, some of us do, and how that impacts on funding decisions and those who do make funding decisions, and talked a lot about governance and different ways of governance, empowering people. So there's a lot more, but I think anything else the group can impart.
So our group was looking at what's missing and who's missing. And interestingly, we picked upon many of the points already raised, but just picking up on the last discussion. The idea of an arts ecology and the fact that, or whatever we want to call it, an ecology, is something that we felt was missing very much from the work done so far. And by that we meant an appreciation that we're working in an environment where people are already crossing boundaries. They're making work and presenting work in many different spaces. There are people doing things, they don't necessarily call themselves artists or whatever. So there's something about us, the report and the work that we do, having a better appreciation of what the ecology looks like, and who's involved in it already, and different ways in which they might get engaged. We also talked about, within that context, the way in which so far the inquiry gives a sense that it's a very one-directional approach, but actually what we're looking for is a two-way exchange, and already we are working in ways where actually, people, human beings, are giving of themselves to whatever the work is that the organisations are making, and we need to better reflect that so that it's less top-down than it currently feels. And also the sense that actually large organisations can and already are working with smaller organisations to make work happen, to make change happen, and similarly the other way around. So again, it's a two-way process. We talked about, I guess, who's missing, the voices that are missing in the room and within the inquiry. And there was a strong sense that there was a lack of diversity in voices, and I guess understanding whose voices they are is something that I think our group were quite generous in saying, come and speak to us, and we can help you to reach those people and to find out who else you need to talk to. But also in that context, a sense of internationalism, because we are working in a very international context, and that flavour was definitely missing and is a gap so far. And then I guess we talked about the importance of fun. So in response to what has been said earlier, that it is important that actually that we find ways of actually helping people through the work that we're doing to understand that this has to be fun too. It is fun too. So how can we bring some of that into the report? And I guess the final thing just to say is that, that there was a big discussion around language. I know everyone else has said it, but I guess we need to find a way of bottoming that out. Otherwise we will end up producing a report that only some of us understand. So I think that was a big theme coming out of our discussion alongside the ecology discussion. So I think that's probably it.